everybody. Thanks for joining us for the latest episode of Sow and Tell. I'm Brian Wright.
And I'm Craig Hoover.
And we want to give you all some updates today. We want to talk about our branding efforts for Armistead. We have an interview, a discussion today with the folks from Circa Brand Agency here in Nashville area, and they have offices elsewhere as well. But we wanted to pick their brains and share some things that we thought would be kind of fun for you all to hear that maybe you don't get to hear when you see other projects or any brand. Actually, like, how did they come up with that? What's the story behind that? And so we thought that it would be sort of fun for you all to hear from them, who helped us create the whole brand and the name and the logo and all of that. And we'll have other discussions like this along the way with different folks who've been helping us create and craft all the different parts and pieces of Armistead. So anyway, we'll jump right in, and Craig will kick us off.
So by way of development update, we have submitted our pre-application. Again, we did it once last fall, and then and as we got into it, we realized that there was a little bit more work to do, a little bit of adjustment to the zoning ordinance that was needed to allow for us to do everything we wanted to do. And so we went through that process. And so we resubmitted a couple of weeks ago. And now we are gearing up for our official submittal. And this is the one that everybody gets to see and the governing bodies get to discuss. And that's our official submittal on May 13th. And as we're recording, this is it's Masters weekend. So it's the second weekend in April.
One thing to say too about the process of sort of the resubmittal, because I think sometimes people even find the sort of mundane parts of a project fascinating if they haven't been involved in something like this before. But the process, as we've shared, is that sort of pre-application where you sort of show them what you're thinking about submitting, then they give you some comments, and then you create your official submittal. Well, when we created our first pre-app, because this project was so unique and so groundbreaking nationally, but especially locally, even though we have so much support from the elected officials and staff and everybody, the rules and regulations hadn't anticipated something so fantastic as this. And so we had to go through a process of refining and tweaking and kind of teaching in some cases, and so that everybody could get up to speed and understand what it was we were seeking to do and everything. And so then they said, would you mind resubmitting your pre-application for us so we can kind of start afresh now that we've gotten a lot of these things ironed out?
That's right. I think we broke the record
for the most number of comments.
Yes,
for
we
sure.
Broke the record for the most number of comments on a design. I think that is both auspicious and inauspicious. But we're proud of that, honestly, because what we're trying to do is something different. And I think that'll bear out when you see the plan eventually. So that next step here is once we've submitted on May 13th, then we'll be put on the agenda for the joint conceptual workshop on May 23rd. And that is, there's no public comments, but the public is obviously invited. And that's when we talk with both the Planning Commission and the Board of Mayor and Aldermen on about the plan. The staff gives their report and say, here's what we support, here's what we don't support, and all that. And so, and that sets us on our way. The first time that the public will get to comment publicly would be at the second reading of BOMA. And that is, obviously, things can get deferred and we can get pushed, but if we stay on our current track, that'll be in mid-August. So stay tuned to this channel and our newsletter and the website and everything. So if you want to support the project, that'll be a time to come out and say so.
Yeah, and that joint conceptual workshop is at City Hall. Mm-hmm. And while there isn't an opportunity for people to stand up at the microphone and comment, it's open to folks, so you can come in participate in as a viewer and watch the discussion. But one way that you can actually speak without speaking is, T-shirts, vote yes to Armistead, sort of setting that, because it's typical for a project to have plenty of people willing to come in opposition and say that they don't want development or they don't want the project. Here we've been really fortunate in having so many people in support, and so if you want to, it would be great to have sort of the cheering section, if you will, and sort of coordinated shirts maybe.
That's right. So, yeah, maybe we should all dress up as sheep.
Yeah. Or farmers.
Maybe that's probably a little bit easier to coordinate. That's right. So where are we in the process right now? Like just the refinement.
Well, one of the things that we've had to do while we've explained and all of that and taught and with the staff, there are some things that we've said, what, actually there's a different way in the plan that we could adjust this or tweak this or make this modification so that they don't have to stretch so far on every single thing, because we want the number of comments that the staff has that then the Planning Commission and the Board of Mayor and Aldermen have to review. We want it to be as limited as possible. And so there are certain things that we feel like are just so foundationally important to what we're doing in the project that we've said, okay, well, we'll have to hold on to these, even if you can't recommend that to BOMA, and then we'll let the BOMA decide, the Board of Mayor and Aldermen decide if it's okay or not. And then there's other things where we could make a small tweak and adjust a road alignment or something, and now it meets engineering standards. So we've basically been going back and forth with the different departments and making adjustments to the plans as necessary in order to kind of simplify it and make it more easily supportable by staff, because they've been going out and working really hard to try to help, but they have limitations because they have regulations, and some of them are not changeable at that stage. So anyway, so we're working on coordinating that plan and finalizing that. The other thing that's really exciting is as part of this, there's been a question as to, well, what are we going to do with the historic farm? And Craig and I were clutching our pearls. We were quite upset one day when we were in a meeting with planning staff, and they had asked us to show and explain more what we're going to do with the farm. And we had dialed in a plan and had all these sort of ideas for uses and stuff. And they said, "Oh, good, this is really good to see. It'll be helpful for those who are skeptical of that you all are really serious about farming." And
we're just like,
we couldn't believe it. We thought, after all that we've said, after all that we've shown, like, we would have to be really terrible people to just be lying about that. So anyway, so we're glad that that's helping with the credibility. But what that means is that we have done a pretty detailed plan. We've gotten engineering and landscape architecture and our planning team working on creating a more detailed plan to start thinking about what can happen in each of the historic farm buildings, and in some ways, maybe most importantly, what can happen between the buildings and in those spaces and how they all connect to each other. And so what we've come up with is really cool. It's really focused on integrating, the vegetables and the animals, orchards, and just creating a really vibrant and sustainable agricultural experience, and so that it's well integrated. We met yesterday with farming consultants talking about, sort of zooming out, not just the historic farm area where the buildings are, but how does it all integrate? And we've been, thinking more and learning more about, that we can actually sort of blend things more than we thought. We don't have to separate them and sort of say, this is where vegetables go and this is where animals go. That it's actually better to start to rotate, not just crops, but animals and plants and things like that. So obviously the orchards probably won't be rotated, but
there could be more interspersed, which
exactly.
I thought that was really neat. Like I was just kind of expecting there to be sort of like the, maybe not grid, but at least a sort of a, here's where the orchard is, and that's where you can go and pick. But they were like, no, we want orchards in and amongst the animals and the veg and all that stuff. I mean, obviously there's a shade thing, but it helps protect against wind. It helps, and it also creates a more diverse wildlife and pollinators. And so there's a lot to be said for that. And I think that's going to make, we've always said diversity is the key to every ecosystem. And so we can have more diversity in more places.
Well, and, even just looking at edible landscaping, we've all talked about, from the beginning of this having native landscaping, but also, whenever possible, we've got these hedgerows all around. And so why not have those big blueberry bushes or, whatever.
Right.
And so, you're just sort of walking around the neighborhood, just, picking a bit as you go, as well as sort of the proper, laid out gardens and beds and crops, et cetera. So anyway, so that'll be exciting, and it's coming right along. But one of the major things that we've come up with is related to the historic farm is that the idea of it really being focused on being super open to the public, and the idea of creating a farm park. And so stay tuned for more details on that. But the way that we were thinking about it is, we've got this great town center, village center right next to it, and it's going to have all kinds of mixed uses, commercial and restaurants and all sorts of things. And we've got these historic farm buildings, and yes, it'll be neat to have some of them have some uses that you might want to go, I don't know, we've talked about a distillery, for instance, and some of that, or a nursery. And so maybe there's a little bit of commercial, but, they functioned as agricultural and farm buildings for all this time. And so the idea of sort of bringing some of that back and thinking about what is sort of an agricultural maker, look like, and maker spaces, and for people who are doing things related to agriculture, we're still bringing in food and processing and those kind of things. But the idea would be for it to be a park. So if you think about Harlansdale, it's a great farm park, but it's more of a park that was a farm, and it looks like a farm. And so what we'd like to do is create this so that it's actually still a working farm component. And so you're there, and you may have your kids at the playground, and somebody's wheeling by a cart of carrots that they just picked to go wash them over in the shed over there. And those sorts of things. So it's very much still working and active and lively farm. And so tying that into the trail network and having a community engagement hub, people coming in for learning and classes and those sorts of things. So we have lots and lots of big ideas and big plans now that are starting to crystallize and come together. So as you can tell, we're really excited about that. So stay tuned.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited about just the public access. This is, we believe in connectivity, not just with the road and pedestrian network, but just with our community. And we want to bring people in, and we want to give them opportunities to just be. We're just not just trying to get them in here to buy. And so we want them to be able to have passive enjoyment of the agriculture, because that's how we spread the word about the importance of the food system and where your food comes from and how it's grown, and the knowledge of that. And so that's part of the things we're trying to do. And so I think that's going to be really exciting. And as we start thinking about how much of the overall property is open to the public, in many ways it's 100%, except for the privately owned the houses,
the lots,
but it, you will be able to walk through, and we want you to come out, and there will be spots to sit down and take in the views of the agriculture and the natural areas and stuff. So that's going to be really neat. But in the interest of time, let's get to Circa. So I want to especially thank Tori Thomas and Emily Little of Circa Brand Agency for joining us. They didn't have to do that, but they were just a real pleasure to work with. And I think they did a great job. And this interview that we recorded talks a lot about the process, and talks a lot about what makes our brand different, not just the brand, but the place. And that obviously feeds the brand and all the different uses for it. So I'm really excited to share that with you. Stay tuned to this channel, sign up for our newsletter, and also just be prepared to come out and support us, because obviously we're going to need it. And we are thinking outside the box. And so we're going to need, our public officials to hear from you, to know that that's what you want, and that's what the public wants. So without further ado, let's kick it over to a few hours ago and talk with Tori and Emily with Circa. And we'll see you next time.
See you.
Circa, welcome to Sow and Tell. Thank you for being here. How's it going, everybody?
Hello, thanks for having us.
We have Emily and Tori from Circa Branding Agency. And as we mentioned, these are the folks that help us develop what we think is a pretty cool brand concept. And we're just here to talk about the process that went into it, how you came to this decisions, or how we made the decisions we came to, and just the thought process behind it. So thank you so much for being here. Guys, tell me a little bit about Circa and yourself.
I'd be happy to. I'll start. I'm Tori Thomas. I'm co-founder and executive creative director at Circa. We have Emily Little here too, who's our creative director. She has been with us for 8 years. Is that right? 9 years?
8 years.
8 years. So we have Circa is a brand agency. We focus on branding and the experience behind an organization, and we do that in a very intentional process. So this type of project, Armistead, was a dream. Working and branding a community is something. Anytime a brand interacts directly with the consumers and with the audience, the more powerful and the more important the brand becomes. So something like Armistead, it's so vital to really be able to communicate that why and what in something as short as like a name and then a logo.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Yeah.
So Emily, creative director, what does that mean you do?
Ooh, creative director. I wear a lot of different hats. As it relates to this project, it was guiding a team on our end of about 3 to 4 people at any given time and making sure that the vision that you all and the short family had for this project was stewarded creatively to that name that we landed on and that visual identity that we landed on, and that everything felt very true to what you all are trying to accomplish with Armistead. And it was really special to be able to enter this process at the stage that we entered, because we were able to work with you while it still was an idea that you were working with the community on. This wasn't already this super developed thing that we then had to sorry, I hope that there's not a lot of noise behind me, and I hope I didn't interrupt myself and you can edit that. But this was not, this was a project. It was important that we entered at the time that we did so that we could work with you to make sure that this identity did feel grounded in the values and ethos of the family. This is a really special project that means so much to the family. And our process enabled us to make sure that their vision was stewarded very meaningfully in a visual way. And not just in a way that you could get, I think, by getting a logo on like Fiverr or Upwork. The conversations that we had with your family or with the short family really influenced this entire project in a way that we created something more meaningful.
That's awesome. So, and how do you guys go about that? How did you extract the information that you needed from us and from the family and from our process?
So starting with that charrette, it was wonderful to see kind of the community coming together, the vision behind the land, and then the history. It was, I know we were kind of more observers there, and then hosting that workshop with the family, with the decision makers, was a huge part of really gathering intel. And then I think, Emily, you should speak to some of that research that was also done. I think this family in particular showed up with, what was it, a 68-page history? It was, and I'm sure, I
Lee
feel like that.
Boone,
Yes, continue.
Lee Boone, a member of the short family, she gave us a 65-page document, which was extremely comprehensive. And it not only spoke to the family's genealogy, but it spoke to all of the farm structures on the land, all of the equipment that's been used over the last several centuries. It spoke to the crops and local flora, which as this conversation goes on, we can talk about how that ultimately influenced the end result for the identity and the name. But it was great to have that resource in addition to all the research that we did, going to the library, having conversations with the short family, that all ultimately influenced the intention we were able to provide.
Yeah. So the first step was the name, right? I mean, that was where we were. We didn't necessarily want to call it the short farm. They had named the farm had long been referred to as Westbrook Farm, but many of you know, we're across the street from West Haven, and we thought it might be a little strange to start a new development across the street from West Haven called Westbrook. That felt a little derivative, if that's the term, but
possibly confusing.
Possibly confusing. Certainly, for the UPS drivers would have been. Wait a minute. So talk a little bit about the naming process, and without going into the names we didn't choose, let's talk about how we got to where we landed.
So I'm glad you brought up the importance of kind of reconsidering the name of Westbrook, because there is a big part of branding is differentiation. It's making sure that it's, a memorable place that's pulling from those like just innate how people communicate. So when we have this opportunity to name a place, we want to make sure we are aware of kind of like a historical reference of a location, but also like aware of modern connotations. So it's really important to find a name that both celebrated what this property has been and was, and then what it can be in the future. I think at one point the conversation was, this needs to be a name that's going to be here for 100 years and hundreds of 100 years. This is like not just a development, it's really a new village. It's like a town. So it's so rare to have that opportunity on the forefront to do it well and intentional. So having that gave us that chance to really like pull from the history of the location, the history of the family, and think of what is right tonally and historically, what's right more than just like what it sounds, what's going to be right in 100 years and not just, now or in 10 years. It's like something that really has staying power. So it was, there were actually so many options just because of like the unique history, the unique individuals. I think the storytelling behind this family, that it's just like, stories from like on a large level to like the small Tinny who planted the crocuses, and like on who was the other Emily, the other member of the family who was like welcomed in, who was kind of the city. There was some member of the family who was came from the city, and when she came in, she was like taught all the processes of the farm, and it was just like a really beautiful story. Alma, yeah. So getting sometimes with names, I think it can be hard to not, we all have our biases. So it can be challenging to name as a group because everyone's coming from a different set of circumstances and different connotations behind names. And being careful to note that it's not always our preference that is what should be the deciding factor. It should be kind of a combination of things. And then another thing with a name is, once a name becomes something, a new name can create like a new connotation. So the challenge there was looking to the past, but also thinking of the future. And I'm trying to think specifically, this ultimately Armistead felt so right because it does speak to the place, it speaks to the history, and it has these like two it balances the two themes that I think we were trying to balance this whole time, of the appeal of country living and like the almost like what is it? It's kind of like the idea of like a wonderful being out in nature and all the wonderful side of nature, with honestly like the hard side of being on a farm. And it's hard work. There's a lot of work, and it's work that it's good work, and it's work that I think a lot of more and more our society is removed from. We don't see what goes into the food that we eat, the milk that we drink, there's so many aspects of life that we are kind of removed from. And I think something like Armistead is looking to reincorporate that in a way that works with a lot of families. It's not actually having to be out there tilling the fields, but it's being able to be a part of that process and living amongst that process. So Armistead just felt like a really great balance of strong, historically accurate, and kind of like that future sense of like place of what this can be in the future.
Yeah. I love how it. I mean, it's a family name, right? I mean, the original, the descendants or the right, the ancestors of the shorts
Yes.
there today, was an Armistead, and it just sounds so close to farmstead that it just kind of fits, right?
Yeah, it does. And, it also, even just like having A as the first letter and then agriculture, and it just kind of like all, homestead, farmstead.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed like a good fit for sure. But even thinking through like, how does that name and the sound and the ring of it and the visual, as we went through and started to talk about, logo and stuff, and get into that. But, even making decisions about capital versus lowercase, and, it's very, very detailed. I think a lot of people don't realize how much thought goes into creating a brand, a name, a place. And so hopefully we can share some of that with them through this discussion.
Yeah. I mean, it's got to be, and you can talk to this. I would imagine that, you probably, I know you work a lot in real estate, but you also work a lot with just businesses, right? And business, not everybody gets to be Apple. And, you start a business and I think in the best of times, you're thinking, man, if this thing goes for 20 years, then I've done my job. Right. And he's like, but here we're actually building a place. It's like, it's a place that's going to be around, like you say, for hundreds of years if we're doing it right. Or actually, if we do it wrong, it'll still be there for 100 years, probably. But, so I just think that's there's so much, sort of weight to that. And then, I mean, you can imagine, naming a child, I mean, how hard that is, all of a sudden it's like, we're going to be around this kid for, probably 50, 60 years. This is going to be around forever. And, but here we are, like, not only we have to name a child, but usually there's, there may be some other stakeholders, but generally it's a 1 or 2 person job to name this child. Right? But here we are with the experts, the developers, and then we have a family that is like 18 people, 12, 18 people that are all weighing in on this. And I just wanted to commend you guys. You guys did such a great job of navigating that, taking the process and making it methodical and rational in such a way that we arrived at somewhere that I think we can all be proud of. And I think everybody is really, really pleased. And I think it's gotten even more pleased since we made the decision. Would you say?
Yeah, no, I think so. It's one of those things where, you give something a name and then it's just kind of like, it starts to just roll off your tongue, and you get, it becomes part of the place. It takes a little bit of time, and kind of like naming a kid analogy. It's like when you first say the name the first time you're to the child, it's kind of like, but by the time they're 10, it's like, of course, and
I can't imagine this person
doing
anything else.
Right. And you think about the other names you considered, and you're like, oh, those would have been the worst name for the kid.
Right.
Yes. It's wild how they then take on the name too. There's like personality behind names, and it's, it's very connected. So naming, I think, is such an important piece, and I love that you brought up that difference. We do work with a lot of groups that already have a name. We're working with the name. The name was probably developed more with like 10, 20 years in mind, possibly, maybe even less. And they run into problems, down the road because things weren't considered. And so either we have to rethink of the name or we have to find some way to make the name work. So having this ability to be really intentional was incredible. And then to speak to this team, this was such a wonderful team. Naming is usually a big blocker in moving forward because the options are endless, and sometimes that ability to have unlimited options really keeps a project from progressing, holds back. And the truth is, while there are endless options, once there is something that feels right, it is worth kind of buying in and going. Like the place will make the name, and the name, they work together. So this family having that clear focus, I think it all does start from this really great process of the name wasn't solving problems that weren't resolved before. The vision was already there, and the name was really just making sure that we brought the vision to life. And that came from, that clarity from your team, the clarity on the family's buy-in before this process even happened. So we were also kind of amazed at the seamlessness that the naming process took. There's usually some barriers to get going, and then barriers along the way, again, with names. it's challenging to find a unique name that does not have any conflict anywhere.
Yeah.
And
Well, and along those lines, I mean, you mentioned that the naming is, often the really difficult beginning step. But I can imagine that sort of moving into the next step of a logo could be, equally difficult, just because you start getting now into visuals and graphics, and people have different preferences. Can you talk a little bit about, kind of how you walked us through the process of the actual logo and the symbology?
I'm going to start a little bit of talking, and then I'm going to let Emily take it over, because you asked about Emily and like creative director and what it means. And Emily is a master at thinking of context and logos outside of just like typical pixels or working just on the screen. She gets kind of into the weeds of like materials and connotation, and again back to like that history. And it's just so wonderful for like a project like this, that it is this opportunity to say so much more with a small symbol. So some of the things are like packed into that process behind the logo. It's just really great. But the way we do it at Circa is we do kind of do some preliminary, almost like mood board styles. We try to think of things more in like the personality and tone than kind of the literal approach, so that we get that building block without putting anything too literal out there. We want that opportunity to really like let it create itself. So we started with that. There was some mood boards. I think that was done almost right after that workshop. So we got some feedback on the mood boards. And then when we went into that logo creation, we just did have a certain buy-in that we were all in the same direction, going the same page. So I think, again, it makes that process so much more seamless. I think another thing that's very helpful with this process is we like that feedback. We like hearing what any of the stakeholders had to say. We wanted to hear what the family had to say. We wanted this mark to really represent the land that they knew so much better than we did. So we were able, by just doing it kind of one step at a time, gives us that ability to take feedback, adjust, and kind of come up with different concepts that wouldn't have been there had we not had more voices involved. So Emily, I'm like, you've got to speak to the process, because I think what y'all did was just so wonderful, and just felt like this mark didn't need to come straight from the computer.
Right.
Yeah, so in addition to like a face-to-face conversation or a person-to-person conversation, a logo is often your first impression, right? Or your first visual impression. And the best logos provide, or they do a lot of storytelling. And they do that storytelling very subtly. It's an amalgamation or an aggregation of details that have come together to create something that feels unique and gives you really a sense of feeling first. And so with this logo, there was that balance around the name Armistead. I loved Jim Short in your last episode, how he was talking about the etymology of the name. Arm, obviously connoting like strength and a sense of industriousness, with stead, a sense of place. And when you hear the name Armistead, without much context, the reality is it leans a little bit more masculine. And our goal really was to balance out that strength with something softer, because this brand needs to be warm and approachable and represent a community that is age diverse, represent a community that works hard but also enjoys like the softer, sweeter moments of like fireflies in a field. Like, how could we evoke all of these feelings through just a logo? And those details added up between the logo mark, so the icon that is often like the visual anchor of a logo, and the word mark, which is the brand name spelled out, which, despite it being a word mark, so something grounded in letter forms, there's still so much personality there as well. So with our logo mark, we leaned into the concept of the yellow crocus, which was planted by Tenny Boyd centuries ago and has become this enduring symbol. It still blooms every September. And so that sense of like strength from this flower plays very well with the sense of strength from the word arm. And in addition to that flower-based mark, there are these roots that again connote creating your place within this community and feeling like you can root in and experience different seasons of life in this community. This community appeals to young families that are maybe just starting to build their life, all the way to retirees who are looking for a slower way of living and to walk out their door and see children laughing and learning lessons from nature. So there's a lot of symbolism within this mark. And then when paired with this word mark, we were very intentional with, again, making it not feel too strong or unapproachable. And so the letter forms are all lowercase. And in addition to being lowercase, they're built using a serif font. And for those who are not typography nerds, a serif font is a font that has those embellishments at the ends of the word, of the letter forms. And this is a more traditional font. And so with that naturally is that sense of warmth that I was alluding to. And so again, all of these details add up to create this mark that feels very warm. And I would be remiss to not include the part of our process that I think really helped, or it really enabled this mark to be effective. And that was that we pulled away from our screens, because this community is about pulling away from your screens and interacting with the earth and the natural environment. And so what we did was we purchased potatoes and other vegetables, and we carved up these potatoes and created these stamps that we then inked up and applied to different textures of paper and then scanned into our computer. And so through that process, we were able to create these flower forms and root forms that felt very much hand done, hand cut, handmade. And this mark not only feels organic for that reason, but when thinking about how the community can interact with it, they should be able to recreate this on their own. Mm-hmm. A child with a piece of chalk on the sidewalk should be able to draw this, should be able to cut it out of construction paper. It's a very tangible mark. So, and not only is it a mark that looks nice, I wish, we could show you this brand style guide, which was created with the goal to enable brand consistency across this physical space. So through wayfinding the community, but also importantly, in the digital realm as well. All of our brands live online in addition to in print, in person, or on a sign. And so it was important that we created a brand and created a style guide to ensure that this brand does translate seamlessly from digital platform to in front of you in print.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And for those of you listening and not watching on YouTube, I'll post a link to the brand guide and the liner notes, and so anybody can go in and download the whole brand and style guide.
So one thing I've got to know though first before we move on is, when you cut up the potato and you made the stamp, did you eat the rest of the potato? Like, did you really?
Of course. We became the brand. Made potato chips.
Yeah. So,
nothing went to waste.
Yeah. So we talked about the name, and also the typeface, and then the logo. And then of course, and a million decisions that go into this, but we had to decide on what colors we wanted to use, right? I mean, and so talk a little bit about how you kind of walked us through that process and got us to where we got.
Yeah, color is such a sensitive subject. And again, because we're building a brand that is going to live tangibly in person, but then also online, it's important that we create a color system that is versatile enough to go between both and is not confusing to apply to either of these places. And so when looking at the color palette, it definitely is grounded in nature. And so we've got the classic like green, which when thinking about a brand that represents like an agri-hood or a community grounded in like sustainability and the organic, I green seems like the obvious color. And so while that's included in our palette, it's certainly not the most prominent color. We balance that out with blues and energetic oranges and eggplant purples. So colors that are very much inspired by how people will be interacting with this community through the farmers market, through laying the grass, looking up at the blue sky. Uh, and these colorways, in addition, we've paid a lot of attention to contrast and making sure that they they mix well together, so that again, there's very much it represents diversity in that way through the palette. We don't lean into just like a two color system that is simple and homogenous. There's a lot of space for this brand to represent its personality in different ways depending on the color applied to it.
Yeah. So I'm curious, Tori. We've talked about this in the past, but I wanted to hear how this conversation has evolved. But like one of the hardest things to do in branding is to measure success, right? How do we know that we did a good job, right? And do we like it? Does it feel good? You know what I mean? So talk a little bit about how you guys are, sort of quantify the value that you bring to a to a client or to a project.
Oh, I so appreciate you asking that, because that is so our mission that I didn't get to mention earlier is to maximize return on creative. So we have this challenge as a creative firm and a brand firm that the work we do, the big value in it is creating great experiences. It's connecting on kind of like a under not a superficial level. It's connecting kind of deeper and connecting in that experiential feeling realm. And when we do that, it makes the results of later things like marketing and web and promotion, all those things so much better when it starts from this place like true value, like brand truth, really being able to express that why. But it is hard. The work we do is very much in that foundation. So it's very challenging because once if it hasn't gone into marketing expression, if we don't have a website to really like add up, how is it? Have all the properties sold? All these things that you actually can measure. It's challenging to measure. So in something like this, what we like to do, and we do measure it in timeline. For us in a project like this, it is important to stay on time. It's important to get this thing launched. So we've seen too many projects get stuck in those like very preliminary phases and then they never get to launch, or there's some blocker that just keeps the idea from ever being seen because of whatever it is. So as a group, our role is to make sure that name, that logo, that initial brand all gets established so that that idea can be promoted, can be put out there, can be realized. And then we do, budget is the other way we would measure. We'd be like, we need to stay on budget. We need to make sure that our part stays where it belongs so that the rest can go into that development and then the other features that really need to be part of this. And then I would say later, so that's probably the two main, and then for us, testimonials, feedback. It's going back and making sure that the brand that we've built is usable. The color palettes are being used, the icons, and then the tone and the things that we're meant to communicate are communicating. So we'd rely right now on like the family's experience, your experience. But once it gets into that real promotion area of like a website or advertising, or even like, a big part of a brand is also just how it's used by the community. I think we would see this as really successful if it's a brand that the community loves to engage with, like loves to wear, loves to promote. And I think we would do our best to measure that. And like, could we look at, I don't know, the sales or the farmers market or even like impressions online. But right now, I'm glad you brought it, because right now the challenge is it is hard to measure how it communicates and what the experience is. But if we did our job right, we set that foundation that it's going to lower marketing cost as you go on, because it's going to lower what you need to do to promote it. there will be like a recognition and a buy-in, because it should communicate on that feelings level and that experience level, things that are more challenging to communicate with, paragraphs of explanation.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and that kind of is a good segue into, what are those next steps? What are we going to do?
Yeah.
How do we, get people engaged and knowing about it, and sort of what are you most excited about for the future for the brand?
Oh, I am so excited about this whole project, because I think it is more than just Armistead, like the agri-hood outside of Franklin. I mean, I think it's a big movement just across our nation, and a big movement to kind of consider like slower living, consider value in like n- nature in it of itself. I mean, again, back to that crocus, I think what was also wonderful about that crocus is it's not necessarily the symbol that most farms would consider. It's not the most valuable part of a farm. It's actually like a really, kind of like pleasant, beautiful experience that you can miss it if you're walking too fast. And then a lot of communities have just, in the process of redevelopment, have ripped out all that, historic flowers and flora, fauna. It's no longer there. It got replanted. And, because that's how I think a typical maybe American development works, is we kind of raise everything because it's easier, and then we build up, house by house, same architect plans, same materials, because it's easier. And it's harder to do that intentionality of what are we trying to build? What do we value? So I think all the conversations around Armistead just make me thrilled about where we're going as kind of as a society, to think and consider the value of those things like a crocus.
Yeah. Well, so if you can imagine where the where we might see this branding going, whether it's on a brochure or a T-shirt or whatever, is that Emily? When you, I know we've seen some in the brand guide as you sort of mocked it up on things. Tell me about. Have anything else come to your mind, or is there anything that you're super excited about where you might see it in application?
Absolutely. Walking through the community. I know that Armistead is not a brand that lends itself to a huge monument sign at the entrance to the community, but seeing it in subtler ways, like on an apron, or etched into a wooden crate at the farmer's market. Just like those small instances that aren't quite overt, but are just like beautiful reminders of the brand essence throughout the community. In addition, I mean, we love a website, so excited to see how that develops as the community develops, as they need an online hub to check in on events and other programs. It'll be fun to see the brand evolve to support those programs. I know through the branding process, at one point we were looking at a firefly as perhaps the mark or the icon that represents the community, and ultimately decided that wasn't right for the primary brand, but it would lend itself very nicely to an outdoor program for children. So starting to envision those types of opportunities is very fun.
Yeah. That's awesome.
And then I want a hat with it. I was thinking about that on as we were preparing for this. I was like, I'm ready to have that on a hat, and to be able to represent it and have people ask me and be like, let me tell you about Armistead. So whenever that gets done, let us know so we can order them.
What's funny, some members of the family got together and we need to get you one.
Do they have it?
Got so excited. No, not a hat, but they did get, they just got fired up, and they were like, they drank out of this like old diner mug, and they were like, we need this with a Armistead logo on it, and
yes,
sure enough, right around Christmas they ordered like 75 of them. So we've got these.
Awesome, I would love to see
the
that.
Armistead logo on them. They're pretty awesome. So it was without consulting our branding team, they still went out and did it, and we're gonna
know what?
Their farm.
That's what a good brand is. A good brand should be able to be owned by everyone. You shouldn't have to, it shouldn't be. There should be like gatekeepers that don't let it be used. We want it to be used by the whole community.
Well, and the thing that was it was really neat, because that was the first time we had seen it on something, like
an
object in the space, you know, rather than on a screen or on a page or whatever. And so it was really neat. And then to be able to come back and like hand them out at the office and to the team and, you know, whatever, it was cool.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I love hearing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So talk about just as we wrap up. I know we've got a little bit of time left here, but I just wanted to talk about how you think we have successfully, or perhaps unsuccessfully, differentiated ourselves, or at least set ourselves up through our branding to differentiate ourselves from, you know, not just other developments, but other places, you know, and other choices that people may have. Because I mean, one of the things that's really interesting is that we're not just, you know, a lot of developments are we're just choosing a place to live, but this is a full sort of, you know, village, right? So it's like it's not only where you want to live, but where you want to eat and where you want to buy your food from and where you want to perhaps just go for a walk or just enjoy the outdoors. And so so in the spectrum of choices that people have, you know, this brand has to serve a lot of purposes. So I'm curious how well you think we did.
I think we all nailed it, because I don't think this brand can exist anywhere else. I think it is only for this 200 acres. It works perfectly, but it's like, that's because of everyone involved in it. It's because of Lee, who wrote down the family history, who recorded all those stories. It's because of every family member who made the time to think of those stories, to relate them, and to make sure that they were recorded, which I also think, when I think of that brand, I'm like, I would love that family history in a published book, in a brand. I'm like, that's the other place. And I'm like, I want that to exist. So, I mean, it is published, but not, you know, in a book style that I've seen. Yeah. So I think that is the beauty of a brand built so intentionally, is it can't be replicated. It really represents this unique space. And then the idea, and honestly, if there are other groups that want to learn from this space, they would be doing it their own way too. And it doesn't feel like any of the other developments that are going on, because it's very unique. It's grounded in a really unique space, a really unique history. And I think that it captured that truth behind the history of both like the land and the family and the legacy, in a way that only could be done because of the process and like everyone's involvement.
Yeah. Well, and you know, from the beginning, we set out to create a national model for how to do, you know, sensitive, sustainable rural growth and development in the way that, you know, communities can feel good about when it's time for a farm that everyone loves and has been there for so long to become something else. And so I think, you know, having a brand that will be attached to that, sort of the importance of this project on the national scale, is going to be neat. And I think this brand will hold up to that. I think people will be talking about Armistead, not just around the region, but all around the country. So,
yeah. Awesome. Well, guys, thank you so much. Shameless plug time. You guys have a website or something of your own?
We do, circacreates.com. So go to our website, check us out. You can follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn are probably the best places to find us, and Tori Thomas and Emily Little. And thank you so much. This was wonderful. We love an excuse to just talk about branding and work, and especially something like Armistead, which is such an incredible project and property. It was just wonderful. Thank you.
Well, each time we do one of these podcasts, we try to, kind of hopefully get better. One thing that I've learned in this one, having two guests with us means that Craig and I have to fight for the armrest on a small regional jet.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. I'm like, I'm going to get behind you here.
Right. Next time we're doing,
what I really love, y'all need the stadium seating. I know we have the benefit of two different locations, though I do love being in person whenever possible, but I love the succulent plant with the microphone inside of it. Yes. It's a really nice touch.
Thank you. Yeah. We were just talking about that the other day. It's in the foreground, and we need to do a little bit of pruning on it because there's some gangly bits.
A little pruning. Very natural. Yes.
Well, guys, thank you so much again, Emily and Tori with Circa. Have a great rest of your day.
Well, thank you. You as well. Good to see you.
We'll talk soon.
Bye.